Take it away, Michael.
Hello, welcome. Welcome to the First Nations information session for Winnis First Nations members. I wanted to, we're going to talk about the Webequie Supply Road on this session around the environmental assessment, the approved tour, I wanted to not just welcome, but also inform any viewers about the Webequie Supply Road website. It's very informative. It has lots of tools and resources that members can download, they can read. We have newsletters, we have fact sheets, we have environmental assessment video tutorials about the studies, the type of studies we're involved in on the Webequie Supply Road, as well as even the study plans, summaries of the study plans, and our current studies that we're doing, particularly the IK studies, the Indigenous Knowledge, and the socioeconomic knowledge. And we have also other bi-weekly information live streaming events held at the supplyroad.ca stream. If you go there, you'll every second Wednesday, what we at 4:30, we have live streaming events that you can participate. So our next one's next week, April 20th, with the topic being human health impact, with guest speakers, as well as the co-host Don and Marion, who will talk about the human health impact assessments and the various surveys that were involved in there. So with this session, specific just for Winnis First Nations, for those that want to learn more about the approved EA and the terms and the proposed tour that was recently approved. So I'm going to flip it over to Don Parkinson, who's from SNC Lavalin, who's going to take you through the presentation.
Thank you, Michael. And as you mentioned, today we're going to play a recorded presentation on the Supply Road project. This is the environmental assessment phase that we're currently in, and this is the first of 3 rounds of consultation during this phase. And so in this presentation, we're going to remind community members about the project, and then explain to them where we are currently in the process, and tell them of some of the activities in the field that have been undertaken so far. And then after that, Michael and I will have a conversation about what we've heard previously from the community, and then after that discussion, we are going to open it up to any questions or comments that you may have, and hopefully we can provide answers. So we're looking forward to a good discussion today. So if our technical team can play the video for us, we'll see you back in about 25 to 30 minutes. Once I get that up and running, there it is. Welcome to the Webequie Supply Road Environmental Assessment Phase Round 1 presentation. Today we are going to talk about the environmental assessment steps, what we have learned from communities, the importance of Indigenous knowledge, road route alternatives, and what happens next. For background, Webequie First Nation is about 250 kilometers from the Hudson Bay and James Bay coasts, and the road runs south of Webequie and then east to the Ring of Fire area. The purpose of the Webequie Supply Road is to move people and supplies to the Ring of Fire area, create jobs and business opportunities for community members, as well as skills training opportunities for young people. This would be done in a way that will preserve and strengthen the community's language and culture. The road will be 107 kilometers long, with 17 kilometers of the length actually within Webequie First Nation reserve lands. The corridor planning area is 2 kilometers, but the actual cleared area will be 35 meters. The road will make 3 large water crossings, one across Winnisk Lake and the other 2 across rivers. And the project will also include temporary pits and quarries, equipment storage areas, and construction camps. Now we are going to talk about the environmental and impact assessment processes. There are 2 environmental assessments actually going on. There's an Ontario or provincial one and a Canada or federal one. Webequie is also doing their own internal assessment of the project. At the end, one report is created for review by Ontario and Canada. There is coordination between the federal and provincial EA processes at different points in the process. One body of documentation, though, one report, one body of documentation will be produced to address requirements of both the terms of reference, which is the provincial work plan for the EA, and what we call the tailored impact statement guidelines, which is basically the work plan from the federal side. Now we are going to talk about the communication we have had with Indigenous communities. When we were developing the work plan for the environmental assessment, also known as the terms of reference for the provincial environmental assessment process, we created a project website. We sent notices to communities, did virtual and in-person community meetings, and made project information available in many ways, such as through the website or by mail. And we've also accommodated during COVID by switching a lot of our in-person meetings to virtual meetings. We have received comments on the environmental assessment terms of reference or environmental assessment work plan from many First Nations and First Nation organizations. These comments are wide-ranging. They talk about many, many different topics. Some of the topics are focused on Aboriginal and treaty rights and interests. There's cumulative effects and the need for regional assessment. So looking at the broader effects of the project and looking at the project from a much sort of higher level in combination with other projects that are either planned or exist in the area. We heard comments on protocols, so ways of communicating with communities and the consultation process. We heard comments on environmental assessment or impact assessment, the actual undertaking of that work. And then we also received comments on participation in capacity funding, providing resources to communities so that they have the capacity to be able to review documents and conduct their own, for example, Indigenous knowledge studies. There were other comments on ownership and maintenance or operations of the road. There were comments on socioeconomic impacts of the project. There were a number of comments on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, as well as water or water quality, and wildlife and plants had many comments as well. So there were comments from a lot of communities, a lot of First Nation organizations, and about many different subjects. Let's move now to talk a bit about the study plans. There are many studies involved in an environmental assessment. The technical team had to prepare detailed plans explaining to the federal government how these studies will be done. So these are very detailed sort of recipes as to how the work will be undertaken at a very technical level, and these were reviewed by the federal government, by experts in the federal government. So there were a number of different technical study plans prepared, and the subjects include geology, terrain and soils, surface and groundwater, air quality and climate change, noise and acoustic, vegetation, wildlife, fish and fish habitat, species at risk, socioeconomics, human health, visual environment, and cumulative effects. Our team also prepared fact sheets to summarize. Now we will talk about how an environmental assessment is done. There are many steps involved in an environmental assessment. One of the steps is to identify what we call valued components. Valued components are the environmental, health, social, economic, or additional elements or conditions of the natural and human environment that may be affected by the project and are important to community members, are of concern or value to the public, Indigenous peoples, federal, provincial authorities, and interested party. They are what people are concerned about. Then we have indicators. Indicators represent the resource, feature, or issue related to a valued component, so what's important to community members. And if these indicators are changed, they may demonstrate an effect on the environment. A better way probably to describe them is a way of measuring potential effects. And it's used in the assessment and evaluation of alternative routes and the overall effects of the project. Now let's talk a bit about assessment boundaries. For each thing that community members think is important to study in an environmental assessment, a valued component, a study area needs to be defined. These are different depending on the valued component, and that's a very important thing to remember. So there are three general study areas. What we call the project area or project footprint. Then we have 1 kilometer on either side of the road center, which is called the local study area, and the regional study area, which is 5 kilometers on each side of the center line of the road. Those are the general study areas. And this next map shows the three basic types of study areas relative to the two alternatives, the community-based alternative and the technically preferred alternative, which looks at the community-based alternative and makes minor changes to the route based on better terrain and soils and other factors. Let's now talk about the study areas for valued components more specifically. The study areas for valued components, or things that are important to community members, are determined by many different things, including what community members are saying, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous land and resource use, and Aboriginal and treaty rights. Now we're going to move to talk a little bit about baseline studies. Think of baseline studies as a way of finding out the way things are now, so what we call existing conditions. And if we know that, we have something to compare to when looking at possible impacts of the project. So it's a snapshot, a picture of the way things are before the project. There are many studies that are done as part of an environmental assessment. These studies look at three general areas: the natural, or what we call biophysical, socioeconomic, and cultural. They're all under these categories. For example, let's look at natural or biophysical. Within that, we would have studies on vegetation, such as the peatlands or wetlands and forests, wildlife, fish and fish habitat, species at risk, air quality and climate change, noise and vibration, visual environment, surface water, groundwater, and geology, terrain, and soils. So there are many studies on the natural or biophysical in the natural or biophysical category. Now, if we look at the socioeconomic infrastructure and social services, then we might look at human health. Might look at land and resource use or indigenous knowledge and land and resource use. Then we look at another major category of studies, which is archaeological resources or built heritage or cultural heritage landscapes. So there are many groups of studies, and even within the studies that I mentioned, there are more studies that are done, more specific studies. For example, if we were to look at caribou, there are a number of different types of caribou studies that are done as part of an environmental assessment or an impact assessment. Let's now look at select valued components as examples. And this will hopefully help everyone sort of better understand what I've just been talking about. So let's look at study areas for wildlife. The general or local study area would be a 1 kilometer buffer, as I mentioned before, from the center line of the alternatives. 500 kilometers from what we call supportive infrastructure. So these are things other than the road that are required as part of the construction or operation of the project. These might be camps or aggregate or rock source areas or access roads. And then the regional study area, general regional study area, extends 5 kilometers on either side of the local study area boundaries. If we look at moose, for example, that has a different local study area. In that case, it's 10 kilometers from the center line of the alternatives, 500 meters from supportive infrastructure, but the regional study area extends 50 kilometers from either side of the local study area boundaries. Then we look at caribou. Caribou have an 11 kilometer buffer from the center line of the two alternatives and from the same distance from supportive infrastructure camps. So it has a bigger distance around it to define the local study area. And then the regional study area for caribou includes entire ranges of caribou, which is these are very, very large areas. Next, and finally for wildlife, let's look at Wolverine. Wolverine has an 11 kilometer buffer from the center line of the alternatives and from the supportive infrastructure, and it extends 50 kilometers from either side of the local study area boundaries. Let's have a look now what that means in terms of maps. So these next few maps will illustrate the different types of study areas I just discussed. So this first one is the general study areas that I was talking about. The next slide shows the different local and regional study areas for moose. And then after that, we have the wildlife study areas for wolverine. So as you can tell, you can see the 50-kilometer buffer around there, much larger area. And then finally, the largest study area you can see here, you can see the local study area on the actual map, and then the regional study area, which includes two ranges for caribou, and that is in the upper right corner. So it's a much larger area. So let's talk a little bit about wildlife again and some of the criteria or valued components associated with wildlife, just to give you an idea of and a better understanding through examples. So for wildlife, you might have forest birds, you might have raptors, you might have shorebirds or waterfowl, or bog and fen birds like muskeg birds and other wetland birds. You might have bats or fur-bearing animals like lynx or rabbits. Ungulates, which are moose, for example. Amphibians and reptiles, and then pollinating insects as well. So the indicators or the ways of measuring those could be, for example, changes to habitat availability, the quantity of habitat available. Is that impacted by the road? Could be changes to abundance, meaning actual numbers, or the distribution, the spatial distribution, where these animals are over the land or water. Could be changes in the species richness. When we talk about that, we mean the diversity of species, the number of different species. Could be changes to survival and reproduction. Could be changes to predator access, habitat use, and population. Or it could be changes in wildlife mortality or due to stress from. So let's talk a little bit about the baseline studies for birds. Spring and fall aerial water bird surveys were conducted in 2019 and 2020. And some of the things that we found were that the large lakes, and this isn't that surprising, were staging areas for waterfowl. Smaller lakes and rivers aren't really used that much by migrating waterfowl. We also conducted breeding bird surveys in 2020 and 2021, and we did listening counts at 263 stations. And we also used things called acoustic recording units at many different locations, actually 89 different locations, to listen to the sounds in these areas. The next slide shows some pictures that were taken from our breeding bird survey fieldwork. We also conducted baseline studies on bats to look basically for how many species are present. So we looked at, as I mentioned, bat diversity or number of species, and we used listening devices, what we call ultrasonic recorders. And we did surveys at 10 different locations. We found 5 species of bat, including the little brown bat, which is endangered in Ontario. We conducted a number of baseline studies on caribou as well. Caribou aerial surveys were conducted in 2018, 2019, and 2021. These are aerial surveys where we have biologists looking down and counting the number of caribou and identifying male, female, and making other observations about other large mammals. We also conducted in 2020 a caribou calving study, both by foot and by helicopter. We conducted a caribou collaring study in 2021, and that helped us identify calving areas where community members where caribou would have their young, winter areas, and identify travel corridors by being able to track the individual caribou across the landscape. And so far, the data has shown that most collared caribou are of what we call the eastern migratory population that winters in wooded areas, but actually has their young along the Hudson Bay shoreline. Next are a few pictures of some of our from some of our caribou aerial surveys. And then the slide after that shows photos from our collaring study as well. So let's talk a little bit next about baseline studies for wolverine and amphibians. We conducted, starting in 2021, a Wolverine occupancy study. And so we set up sampling stations called run poles that at 25 different sites within 10 kilometers of the planned road center line. And then these stations were set up to include what we call snag posts to collect hair from the animals that would visit. And then there were wildlife cameras set up. From this work, Not only did we get a boundary of Wolverine in Ontario, and we've gotten some really interesting results from that. We also did some amphibian studies where we sampled for calling frogs by using these acoustic recording units that we had set up for breeding bird studies. And this allowed for evening surveys to be done in these remote muskeg or wetland areas that we wouldn't be able to get access to otherwise. So next, let's move on to talk a little bit about Indigenous knowledge. A big part of an environmental assessment is Indigenous knowledge. We have, with the Webequie Supply Road project, an Indigenous knowledge program. We need communities to share their Indigenous knowledge with the technical team to help us identify potential project effects. This helps us avoid or reduce potential effects on Indigenous rights and interests. As part of doing this work, we take the Indigenous knowledge that we are able to collect. We make sure that it is kept confidential to whatever degree the community would like us to. And then we combine this information with the Western science information to very comprehensively identify impacts of the project. We want to work together with your community to collect important Indigenous knowledge. As I mentioned, we will respect the need for confidentiality. We have communicated with communities about the need to collect Indigenous knowledge for the project, and we've also invited communities to participate in our Indigenous knowledge program. So again, this is a very, very important part of this environmental and impact assessment, collecting Indigenous knowledge, and we really would like to encourage communities to provide that input to us so we can make sure that we've assessed impacts of the project very, very thoroughly. Let's move now to talk a bit about consideration and evaluation of alternatives. We have different route alternatives that have been developed by working with community members. Of the two alternatives, one is what we call the community preferred route, and the other is based on where the best land for road building is. So it's sort of the technically preferred route. We're also looking at different locations for sources of road building material, such as gravel and rock. This next map shows the two alternatives. In yellow is the community preferred route, which was derived by Webequie First Nation members meeting over a fairly long period of time to discuss the best possible route for the road. And then the green line represents technically preferred version of that route, looking at the best areas to travel through in terms of best terrain to build in generally, and other factors as well. Each alternative does get evaluated in detail, and there are many factors involved in that evaluation, such as natural environment, Indigenous knowledge, land and resource use and interest, socioeconomic and cultural heritage, and of course the technical side, cost, constructability, and safety. And the purpose of the evaluation of these routes and aggregate or rock sources is to identify a preferred route and preferred locations for sources for aggregate and rock that has the least potential for bad effects, for negative effects, and the greatest opportunity for controlling those negative or bad effects, and offers the community the greatest benefit as well. The evaluation of alternatives also considers other facilities that are part of building the road, such as temporary access roads to get to those gravel pits and quarries, for example, to get to the laydown and storage yards, construction camps, as well as bridges. Let's talk a little bit about consultation approach and next steps. We will be talking to communities in the next few months. We have 3 rounds of consultation planned as part of the environmental assessment phase of the project. This presentation is for round 1. But as you can see in this slide, we have the 2 other rounds, round 2 coming up hopefully in fall of 2022, and in winter or spring of 2023, the final round, round 3. This round talks about the overall IA process. It talks about the IK program. It talks about criteria and indicators, the evaluation of alternatives. The next round, round 2, will summarize the input that we got, identify alternatives, identify preferred routes for the road and aggregate or rock source areas, and provide some preliminary engineering design elements. And then finally, round 3 will be a summary of round 2, what we found in round 2, and a summary of preliminary effects, early effects based on our analysis of the project, and proposed ways of managing project impacts or mitigating impacts, limiting or controlling impacts, and then talking about follow-up monitoring, either during construction or post-construction. We will be collecting your feedback on the project in many ways, including community meetings, interviews, open houses, live streaming sessions, the project website, and social media. There are many different ways available to collect feedback from your community, and we welcome input from you in terms of how you would like to communicate with us. In terms of next steps, let me just talk about where we are here now. We are looking for input to finalize the criteria and indicators, as well as identify study areas for the valued components. We're looking to continue with our baseline studies and collect Indigenous knowledge. Now, in fall of 2022, we're looking for input to evaluation of alternatives and selection of the preferred route and locations for the construction material sources, aggregate and rock. And we'll be doing the preliminary engineering design of the road. Then, in winter of 2023, we'll be getting input to preliminary effects, assessment of the project, and input to proposed impact management, mitigation, and follow-up monitoring. And then finally, in the summer and fall of 2023, there would be a review of the draft and final environmental assessment report or impact statement, the document that goes to both the provincial and federal governments. We want to hear from you. Please provide us with your comments through the project website, which is supplyroad.ca. Speak with the project team after the presentation. Fill out a feedback form. We have contact information on the screen for you. We welcome your input. We will respond to you, and it will make the environmental assessment and impact assessment better with your input. Thank you for joining us today. Miigwech, and we will see you soon. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video and it provided some useful information to you. Now, Michael and I are going to have a brief discussion on some of the input that we got from community members when we paid Winisk a visit a couple of years ago during the terms of reference phase. I'll first go over, and Michael, feel free to jump in whenever you want. I'll first go over some of the questions we got from Chief and Council when we met with them. And the first question was, who is financing the environmental assessment? And so we responded to all these questions, and in this case, it was the province of Ontario. We also got a question, will the draft terms of reference and EA be presented to communities? And it will be, and it has been. In the TOR case, everything is a very transparent process. There's opportunities, many opportunities to like whether formal or informal, to comment on the terms of reference or on the actual EA document itself. Another question that we got was, is it possible for economic benefits such as employment to outweigh environmental concerns? And the answer, I guess, basically is, Mike, yes, it is possible. You know, there's a decision that's made by the regulators, right, as to whether this is in the public interest and whether they feel that any impacts have been mitigated enough, right, reduced enough.
Yes, that's a very important point, because it's even so for Webakwe. like, the whole purpose of why they're doing an environmental assessment, and studying the waters, the vegetation, the mammals, the birds, the fish. Like, there's such a range of studies, as they really, really want to understand, what they call baseline conditions. The how are these things today, and they're trying to get a snapshot of that. And then, and you lay, and then what happens when you lay, there's dirt road, that they're thinking of building. Because one of the ways that Webakwe, Webakwe has to go through their own approvals. If the membership is not comfortable, of moving forward, that's that's one level of approval. And there's the provincial approvals, when it comes to the tour, and then there's the impact assessment approvals by the federal government. So there's actually three levels of approvals that they'll consider this question, whether or not the benefits of a road, an all-season road, outweighs any impacts on the land or on the people, or on the wildlife and the waterways, etc. So, in order to answer that question, you actually have to do very technical studies, and those technical studies help inform your decision making. Because right now, no one really knows what is the true impact, and then looking at and asking specific scenarios about those impacts and what can be done to mitigate them, to avoid them, to manage them, kind of thing. So there's roads all over North America, all over Canada. Canada's a very large country, the second largest in the world, and there are roads everywhere. And so, a lot of the infrastructure in the past didn't really go through like a rigorous process, as we are going now with these roads, given the pristine area. So those community members, the Webakwe community members, have the very same concerns, and it took a lot of effort, community education, engagement, to understand why we're doing an environmental assessment. It's to generate information to make informed decisions, for chief and council and the membership. So any major undertaking, in Canada has to go through an environmental assessment, not just for the public, but for the Indigenous community, so they can have a say into it. So a lot of people say that this is all approved. It's just a perfunctory exercise. It's not. There are projects that have started at EA and never got approved in Canada. So this is a big project. Relatively, it's, even though it's just a dirt road, but it's a big undertaking for the community to have something like that in their homelands. That they know, it sits upon bog and swamp and peatlands, and then going over across waterways and stuff. So they want to make sure that things are properly done and properly structured, and properly mitigated, for any things like maybe dust. No one likes dust. You go to any of these communities that have dirt roads, like it doesn't take much in the middle of summer to have a dust storm, as they're going from one meeting to the other. So that's a very good question. So the benefits really does have to outweigh any impacts on that. But right now, we're getting the studies done, so we can understand what is the baseline, what happens when you put a road upon that baseline, and then let's talk about the effects around that.
Well, it's so true, Mike, and so much effort is put into those baseline studies that you were referring to in so much detail, because we want to get as accurate a picture as possible of the way things are now, because with that, we can better identify potential impacts. And it just makes the whole process a more effective process, and protects and protects Webequie and protects its neighbors as well.
Mhm.
So one of the other questions we got, Mike, was, are other communities talking about a wildlife management plan? And this is a great question. And I think a lot of people don't realize that as part of an environmental assessment, typically what comes out of it is a series of management plans for construction phase and for operations phase as well. And given a project of this nature and where it is, you've got incredible, like, rich diversity of wildlife, in particular caribou and moose, and community members depend on these to sustain themselves. And so making sure as part of this work that populations are stable and not decreasing as a result of the project, and understanding where the animals are moving. Are they changing their habitat, or their habits and moving to different areas? Is their habitat being effective? It's all critical. And so Pewanik did, or Winisk did mention when we went there, Mike, you remember, they're actively doing monitoring in their homeland right now. And so their question was, are other communities asking for the same thing? And we have heard that from other communities as well. And then another question that we did get was, how many rivers will the road cross, and which rivers? So there's 3 major crossings, one of Winisk Lake, and then the other 2 to the south across Winiskis's Channel, and then the Mukatai River near the eastern end of the project. Now, in terms of environmental concerns that Winisk community members brought up, and this one I'm sure you want to jump in on, Mike, is downstream impacts of mining and mining related development, including the Supply Road project.
Yes. So yeah, I remember that because the chief and council and some of the staff there was there as well, and we had to clarify that the environment, like this draft tour that we were presenting, was not for the mine, right? It was actually for this 117-kilometer road, that if they wanted to talk about the mine, they would have to talk to the miners, which Webequie is not. What they're looking at is an economic development road to provide some opportunities around supplies and materials, and moving people to job sites from their community. So that was the primary purpose, for the Webequie Supply Road. And then we had to sort of defer chief and council to Noront around questions around the mining and operations of that mine. So all we can speak to when it comes to environmental assessment is the Supply Road, because that's the Webequie portion. They have their purpose of why their reasons why they want to move supplies and materials to the exploration activities and the proposed mine site. Yeah, so that was a good question. Okay, there's a question here from online here on the EA for mapping. What area is Webequie stating is their traditional land for them? So that's a good question. Webequie was part of the Far North land use planning exercise. So I believe, they submitted I think the part of the process around the Ontario Far North Act was that the communities that want to participate in that could develop what they call basically a terms of reference, for their community-based land use planning. And in that terms of reference would have been sort of what they call a planning zone. So like planning, like what area are they planning, for their community-based land use planning. So part of that process was actually engaging with, the harvesters, the land users, and other traditionalists, that use different sites, ceremonial sites, etc., around, the Webequie, both on Webequie Reserve and then off reserve on there. So that plan wasn't. I think the terms of reference was completed, but I don't think the community-based land use planning was finalized yet. So it takes time to generate that data for that. So I think they're in the process. I think they have a planning zone, but I'm not sure if their traditional boundaries were clearly delineated yet. Just based on how the process goes. So when you're doing community-based land use planning, you do interviews. So a lot of the interviews are based on family clans. So one area you're talking to a number of people. This is a big community. On one part of, like, say, towards Casablanca, or talking about the west side or southern west side, talking in the Benimic, and so different families use different areas. And has different trap lines or hunting, harvesting areas, and within different seasons. So, yeah, so that, like, the traditional lands, I think that the boundaries, there is the M&R planning boundaries, and then I think within the planning boundaries was where they were doing their community-based land use plan.
Thanks for that, Mike. Another concern that was brought up was over harvesting by neighbors to the south.
Yes.
As well.
So I wasn't sure which neighbors they were talking about. Like, I think there were First Nations hosting other First Nations, in the goose hunt. And I don't know if it was specific to geese or caribou, but that was a concern. And it's, we could, one of the neighbors is Webequie, so it wasn't really specified, which neighbors in the southern part, but we brought it back to Webequie, and they weren't sure. I guess they weren't sure, about any over harvesting. They kind of are their own stewards of their land, like of their. They don't technically, I guess, over harvest. Because they want the animals to come back, because they do eat traditional foods and fish, and just like many other people in the far north.
Mike, another concern that we heard was that the environmental assessment should include wildlife studies on population and movement to examine changes in population, particularly with regard to moose and caribou. And I wanted to say that these are being done. There's extensive studies being done, as you know, Mike, on this project. I mean, with caribou, there have been, I believe, 3 aerial caribou surveys, winter caribou surveys, which also look for other mammals as well too. So those were done in between mid-February and mid-March. So that gave our team a pretty good idea of, especially doing it over 3 different years, of how many and where the caribou were at the different times. And we've also done nursery surveys, caribou nursery surveys, looking at areas, the nursery areas where there's calving of caribou and moose as well, to better understand important habitat areas. What else have we done? Oh, we've done GPS collaring of, we collared 29 caribou, I believe, just over a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago. And so those are actually being tracked. Those caribou are being tracked and followed in real time online. So we're getting a better idea of the areas that they use at different times of year. So that's giving our team a really good insight into the behavior of the animals and the changes in population as well too. So there's a lot of studies being done there. And looks like we got another question here, Mike.
Yeah. So it says, I heard you say an EA process is up to primarily web for it to be approved in neighboring communities. How do they fit into the EA process? It is a check mark to say we consulted even if valid concerns are brought up. Yeah, so the EA process, maybe I spoke too quick on that question. So Webequay Road is there's 17 kilometers on Webequay's, 17 kilometers of the road starts at their airport, is on reserve, and then it goes to the proposed mine site and mineral exploration activities. So there's actually 3 levels of approvals. There's 2 ministerial approvals, 1 federal. There's a federal impact assessment, which is a different legislation that guides impact assessments, that tells the proponent, this is all the things you have to study. That's the difference between the federal government and provincial government. The federal government tells the proponent, these are the range of studies you have to do. In Ontario, you submit a draft, a proposed tour, which is another word for like a work plan, environmental work plan. Here's the range of studies you have to do. So here's a range of studies that we submitted to the provincial government that has to approve that work plan. And then once that work plan is approved, then you actually do the studies and the assessment around that. So out of those 2 federal provincial process will come 1 report, a combined report, the integrated report. And in that report, it goes through public review, but also goes through Webequay's review, because in the Indian Act, and we're still trying to determine this, there may be a requirement for a land designation process. So 17 kilometers of that land on reserve, 17 kilometers of the road that's on reserve may require a vote by the membership, whether they want the road there or not. So that's what I mean by approvals, like 17 kilometers on reserve has to be approved, maybe require an approval by the membership. And then the other levels are the provincial approvals and the federal approvals. So as for the other communities, their input is very material, very important to this process. Now, we can't force chief and council, to force us into your community to talk about whatever it is that you guys want to talk about. It's up to chief and council, to allow us in, with the proper protocols, to share the information that we're generating out there, as well as hear what the concerns are, what the issues are, what the fears around impacts on the land, the way of life, etc. And then part of our job when we come visit communities to share information and engage and consult is actually document all those things, put them into a report, like a separate report specific, say, for WSR, and bring that report back to WSR to see if we captured accurately as possible the issues, the concerns, the impacts, the questions you have, if we answer them. So it's every community is different in how they participate. WSR was one of the communities that got involved and actually submitted comments, gave comments on this project when we went in there. So we're open, for those listening to come into WSR, Pewanik, and have further discussions. This is just beginning. It seems like a long time since we started the draft tour, 2+ years ago before COVID. But because of COVID, things slowed down, got delayed. But now it's been approved. And part of the approval is to talk to communities in a very deep way about the process, about the EA. So it was very explicit in the approval. So when you get approvals for projects, the government puts terms and conditions on it. So part of the terms and conditions on the approved tour was to have substantial engagement with the communities, with the individual report that we have to bring back to the communities on if we capture their issues, their concerns, and their impacts, and come back a second time, and then come back a third time, on the as we go through the EA process. So there is no check.
Sorry, Mike, I just wanted to add to what you were saying as well too. Clendon mentioned in his question, is it a check mark to say we consulted even if valid concerns are brought up? And I can say, and I know you'll support me on this, there's been many occasions where concerns were brought up during, for example, the terms of reference process, that work plan review process, where we did make changes to the terms of reference, right? Based on those comments, where additional studies were included in our work plan, in our tour, to address concerns that had been raised by communities, right?
Mm. Yeah, and that's the reason why the provincial governments offered capacity funding for communities to help participate, and then get some technical support from advisors, some community members to get involved and help with facilitating that. So the province of Ontario has actually offered all 22 communities, or I think majority of the 22 communities, capacity funding to get involved. So it's there, and we encourage the Indigenous communities that have concerns, that have issues, or are very interested in this, to access those funds, to apply for them. I don't think anybody got denied. I think you just apply and use those funds to get involved in the process, because it matters. It matters to us.
So that covers the questions and concerns that WNISC had when we visited the community. Maybe we can open it up now to any more questions or comments on the project, if anyone has them.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, we've got a question here from Clendon. So if WFN doesn't respond and the EA process has noted the attempts for contact with no reply from WFN, could this be deemed as you have tried and go forward with completing the EA?
So can you clarify who WFN is? That Webequie First Nation, or is that WNIS First Nations? So WNIS. So if WNIS First Nation doesn't respond and the EA process has noted the attempts for contact with no reply from WNIS First Nations, could this be deemed as you have tried and go forward with completing the EA? Yeah, so we try every week. Every week we send letters to the chief through emails. We did send the draft tour to WNISC, and part of our outreach is this here, specific to WNISC. We have bi-weekly live streaming events on every Wednesday, every 2 weeks, as well as a Wawate radio show every 2 weeks, talking about WSR, looking for comments, looking for are there issues people have, or concerns are being raised. So again, we attempt almost every week, to reach out to all 22 chiefs, and we respond to those that reply to us. Some respond with very detailed questions. Some respond with invitations, to come when COVID's over. So we're almost always on standby. Once the community says, please come in, like Webequie did, because Webequie has to be, even though they're the proponent, Webequie still has to consult its own members, and it has to be on the record, just like WNISC. just like every other community, like it has to have its own record of consultation. And so anytime, as throughout the COVID, because it came in different waves in the last 2 years, there was an opening, then we would go in based on the request of the community. So, I mean, it's up to, I guess, chief and council, when they're ready for us to come in, we will come in, we'll accommodate any invitation to WNISC at any time.
No, I like you said, Mike. I mean, we're trying our best to contact communities and get their comments, outside of the formal comment periods that are associated with the documents, right? Our door is always open to input, and we're also trying to, and I think you touched on this before, try to make the information a little bit more understandable, because it does get very technical, and that's why we've been doing these radio shows on Wawate, and that's why we've been doing these streaming sessions every other week as well.
With translation.
With translation. So we're trying our best to reach as many people as possible and make the information as understandable as possible, because we do want your input. That's what we're here for. We want to make this a comprehensive process, and Webakwe wants us to as well, because like you said, they have their own decisions to make on this project as well, don't they, Mike?
Yeah. You can also you can follow us on social media as well. Our social media team, does its best to share about Webakwe, as well as share about the project. And then inform. We have an e-newsletter. You can sign up. Just go to the supplyroad.ca. You can sign up if you want to, stay updated and submit comments and any concerns. As a member of WNISC, we're open to receive it, and it will be on record, whatever, in our response to you.
Absolutely. We'll see if there's any other questions. I don't see any more questions. Doesn't look like it. Glendon, thank you for your questions. Those are great questions. I love getting questions, don't you, Mike?
I do. It makes it more interesting.
It sure does. Absolutely. So looks like that wraps up today's session. Oh, we got another comment from Glendon. Nice comment. Great job in answering my questions. Now for the big one. Can you tell me where to find the caribou right now?
That's funny.
Glendon, those are state secrets. The biologist won't even tell me. So if I don't know, every time I ask, they say no. We're not telling you. So I wish I could. Thanks for asking your questions, Glendon, and thanks to everyone who joined us. And we will be back here again in a week, Mike, talking to Gasheshawan, I believe.
I believe so, yeah.
I think so. So we're moving our way along the coast. So,
but people can participate next week, April 20th, on WSR, again, supplyroad.ca. We send this out to everybody. We have bi-weekly live streaming, as well as Wawate radio shows every second Wednesday, and the next one's April 20th on human health impact.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks to everyone who joined us. And we will be in touch again very soon with your community. And if you would like us to come and visit, we'd be happy to come and visit. I can tell you that. Thanks again for joining us all.